Do not drink from that cup. Those were the first words Count Adrian Blackwell ever spoke to his bride, and Clara Whitmore would remember them long after the candles guttered low, long after the storm pressed its cold hands against the windows of Ravenshade Hall, long after she understood that the king had not sent her there to be married, but to be buried. The cup was already at her lips when his voice cut through the bridal chamber, low and sharp enough to still the blood in her veins. Clara froze, her gloved fingers trembling around the delicate stem. Across the room, her husband stood half in shadow, dressed in black as if the wedding had been a funeral and he the only mourner willing to admit it. He had not spoken in the chapel. He had not spoken in the carriage. He had not spoken when the servants led her into this room of dark oak, cold stone, and candlelight that shivered against the walls like frightened gold. Until now, Clara lowered the cup by a single inch, her breath caught somewhere between fear and obedience. "Your lordship?" she whispered, though by law he was no longer merely her lordship. He was her husband, the ruined Count of Ravenshade, the man mothers used as a warning, courtiers used as a jest, and the king had chosen as Clara's punishment. Adrian crossed the room with measured steps, his pale face unreadable, his gray eyes fixed not on her mouth, nor on the bridal lace at her throat, but on the red wine trembling in the cup. "Set it down," he said, not loudly, not cruelly, but with such quiet command that Clara obeyed before pride could remind her she was still a lady, even if the crown had treated her like a parcel to be delivered before dusk. The glass touched the table with a faint ring. Adrian took a silver spoon from beside the untouched supper tray and dipped its edge into the wine. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the polished silver dimmed, clouding over as though a shadow had passed beneath its skin. Clara stared at it, the room tilting softly around her. Outside, rain struck the tall windows in silver lines. Inside, the candles seemed to draw back from the cup. "What does that mean?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. Adrian did not answer at once. He lifted the cup, walked to the hearth, and poured the wine into the fire. The flames hissed and bent low, as if recoiling. Clara's hand went to the back of the chair to steady herself. Only hours earlier she had stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the royal chapel, while King Roland Ashbourne smiled down at her with the mercy of a man signing away someone else's fate. She had been told she was fortunate. She had been told the crown was granting her protection. She had been told the Count of Ravenshade, disgraced and abandoned, required a wife of noble blood, and that her family's loyalty would be remembered if she accepted with grace. But no one had asked whether she wished to accept. No one had looked at her long enough to see that beneath the veil, her lips were colorless with dread. Adrian turned from the fire, the empty cup hanging at his side. "It means," he said, "that someone expected you to die before morning." Clara's knees nearly failed her, but she did not fall. She had learned in palaces that terror must be swallowed silently, like bitter medicine. "Who?" she asked. The Count's gaze moved toward the sealed wine box resting near the supper table, its wax marked with the royal crest. A crown pressed into red. A blessing made to look like honor. "Someone powerful enough," he said, "to send death as a wedding gift." The words should have made him monstrous. Instead, they made him the only honest thing in the room. Clara looked at the man she had been forced to marry, at the cold restraint in his face, at the weariness buried beneath his stillness, and for the first time that night, she wondered whether Ravenshade Hall was not the trap. Perhaps it was the shelter. Perhaps the true danger had smiled at her from a golden throne. 12 hours before Clara Whitmore watched poisoned wine darken a silver spoon, she had been standing beneath the painted ceiling of Ashbourne Palace, trying not to shiver in a room that was warmer than any place had a right to be. Fireplaces burned along the marble walls. Gold mirrors caught the light of 100 candles. Courtiers stood in careful clusters, their silk sleeves whispering whenever they turned to look at her. Clara wore her mother's white gown, altered twice and still too loose at the shoulders, with seed pearls sewn along the cuffs where the fabric had begun to fray. It was the finest thing she owned, and in that room it looked almost poor. She kept her hands folded because they wanted to tremble. The summons had come before dawn, carried by a royal messenger who would not meet her eyes. Her aunt had wept quietly while fastening Clara's buttons, though she had not dared to say the truth aloud. A summons from the king was never an invitation. It was a door closing behind you. King Roland Ashbourne sat upon the raised throne beneath a canopy of deep crimson, his silver hair shining like frost beneath the crown. He smiled when Clara curtsied, but the smile did not reach the pale blue of his eyes. "Lady Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "your family has long served the crown with loyalty." Clara lifted her chin. "We have tried to, your majesty." A faint murmur moved through the court. Tried was not a word people used before a king. Roland's smile sharpened by the smallest degree. "Then today your loyalty shall be honored." Behind him, Lord Malcolm Vane stood with his hands folded over the head of his cane, watching her as a man might watch a candle he intended to snuff before leaving the room. Clara had seen him once before, 3 nights earlier, in the eastern corridor where no lady should have been walking alone. She had been searching for her cousin after the winter banquet, passing beneath portraits of dead queens, when she heard a sound behind a half-open door. Not a scream, not even a cry, only the breathless murmur of a young man saying, "Tell her." The black seal, then silence. Clara had glimpsed a fallen goblet, a torn glove, and Prince Edmund's hand hanging over the edge of a velvet chair, his signet ring catching the candlelight. Before she could understand what she was seeing, Lord Malcolm had appeared at the far end of the corridor. He had smiled then, too. The next morning, the palace announced that the prince had died of a sudden fever. Now, in the throne room, Clara felt his gaze on her like cold metal. King Roland raised one jeweled hand, and a clerk stepped forward with a parchment bound in red ribbon. "By royal decree, you are to be wed before sunset to Adrian Blackwell, Count of Ravenshade." The words entered the room gently, almost gracefully, and destroyed her life without raising their voice. A woman gasped behind her fan. Someone whispered, "The ruined Count." Clara did not turn. She had heard the name. Everyone had. Adrian Blackwell, who had once advised generals and dined with princes, now lived 30 miles north in a decaying hall surrounded by black pines and older rumors. They said he betrayed the crown. They said every bride connected to Ravenshade was marked by sorrow. They said he had not spoken in public for years. Clara looked up at the king. "Your Majesty, I do not understand." "Understanding is not required," Roland replied softly. "Obedience is." The court fell still. Even the fire seemed quieter. Clara felt the weight of every eye upon her, measuring whether she would break in public. She thought of her aunt's trembling hands, of the small house they rented beyond the west gate, of the debts that had gathered around her family after her father's passing like crows on a fence. The king knew all of it. That was why he did not need chains. Hunger, reputation, and royal favor were enough. Lord Malcolm stepped closer and offered her a narrow smile. "His Majesty is merciful, Lady Clara. A lesser monarch might have forgotten your family entirely." Clara understood then that this was not mercy. It was disposal wrapped in white satin. She had seen something in the eastern corridor. She had heard words meant to die with a prince. And now she was being sent to a man the court already believed cursed, where any misfortune that befell her would seem almost expected. She curtsied because refusal would ruin the last people who loved her. She curtsied because dignity was the only possession no king could remove unless she handed it to him. "As His Majesty commands," she said. The king nodded, pleased. Lord Malcolm's eyes gleamed. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, beneath a sky heavy with rain, a silent count was being prepared to receive a bride who had already been chosen for death. By late afternoon, the royal chapel had been dressed not for joy, but for command. Rain slid down the tall stained-glass windows in wavering lines, blurring the painted saints until their faces looked like witnesses ashamed to watch. White candles stood in iron branches along the aisle, their flames thin and restless in the draught that moved beneath the great doors. There were no garlands, no music bright enough to soften the air, only the low whisper of court silk, the creak of polished pews, and the measured footsteps of guards posted where family should have stood. Clara Whitmore waited at the chapel entrance with her veil lowered over her face, her mother's gown pale against the red carpet beneath her shoes. It had been cleaned, pressed, and laced with care, but nothing could make it feel like a bridal dress now. It felt like a farewell. Her aunt stood beside her, allowed only a moment before being led away, and pressed a handkerchief into Clara's palm with fingers that shook. "Keep your heart quiet," the older woman whispered. "Quiet hearts survive." Clara wanted to answer, but the doors opened before she could speak. Every head turned. The chapel stretched ahead like a long white corridor into judgment. At the far end stood King Roland beneath the royal balcony, his expression composed and generous for the eyes of the court. Beside him, Lord Malcolm Vane leaned on his dark cane, the silver handle shaped like a hawk's head. His gaze found Clara through the veil, and the corner of his mouth lifted. Then she saw the groom. Adrian Blackwell, Count of Ravenshade, stood near the altar in a black coat cut in an older fashion, severe and plain beside the jeweled brightness of the nobles around him. He wore no wedding smile, no flower pinned to his lapel, no sign of triumph at receiving a wife by royal decree. He looked as if he had been summoned from a grave and had come only because the dead were no longer permitted to refuse kings. His dark hair was neatly tied back, though rain had touched the edges of it, and his face carried the pallor of a man more familiar with candlelight than mourning. Clara heard the whispers rise as she began to walk. Poor thing. Better Ravenshade than the debtor's court. They say the Count has not hosted a guest in 7 years. They say his house keeps its widows. Clara kept her chin level, each step measured, each breath hidden. The floor seemed longer than it had from the doorway, and the bouquet in her hands felt heavy, though it held only winter lilies. When she reached the altar, Adrian turned his head slightly toward her. For one brief moment, through the lace of her veil, their eyes met. His were gray, not cold exactly, but guarded by something older than dislike. Something wounded, something watchful. He did not bow over her hand. He did not offer comfort. Yet his gaze flickered once toward Lord Malcolm, then toward the king, and Clara felt the faintest change in the air between them, like a door closing against the weather. The bishop began at once. His voice echoed beneath the arches, solemn and hollow. Clara answered when required, though the words seemed to come from someone standing several feet away. Adrian answered too, but only in the smallest movements, a nod, a lifted hand, a quiet assent barely above breath. He did not speak her name. He did not look at the king. When the ring was presented, Lord Malcolm stepped forward with a velvet cushion bearing a narrow band of gold. Clara noticed the red wax seal on the small box beside it, stamped with the royal crest. Adrian noticed it too. His fingers paused before he took the ring. It lasted less than a second, but Clara saw it. A hesitation, a warning buried inside silence. Then he slid the ring onto her finger with a touch so careful it startled her more than roughness would have. His glove brushed her skin, cool and brief, and he withdrew as if even kindness could be dangerous in that room. The bishop declared them husband and wife, while thunder murmured beyond the windows. No cheer followed. Only the soft shifting of a court relieved that the spectacle had ended without scandal. King Roland descended from beneath the balcony, took Clara's hand, and pressed a ceremonial kiss above her knuckles. "Be grateful, Countess," he said softly, so only she and Adrian could hear. "Ravenshade is more mercy than some secrets deserve." Clara's breath stopped. Adrian's face did not change, but the hand at his side tightened once inside the black leather glove. Lord Malcolm appeared behind the king with a servant carrying a sealed wooden case. "A gift for the wedding chamber," he said smoothly. "His Majesty's finest red wine, to warm the first night." The servant placed it in Adrian's care. The Count looked down at the royal seal, then up at Clara. Still, he said nothing. But for the first time since the decree, Clara understood that his silence was not emptiness. It was restraint sharpened to a blade. The carriage left the royal chapel as dusk folded itself over the city, and Clara watched Ashbourne Palace disappear behind a veil of rain, its golden windows shrinking into blurred squares of light until they looked less like home than a warning. She sat opposite Adrian Blackwell, her new husband, with the sealed wooden case between them on the floor, the royal crest pressed into the wax like a red wound. The wheels rattled over wet cobblestones, then softened as the road turned north beyond the last lamps of the capital. For several miles, neither of them spoke. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, the wedding ring cold against her skin, while the scent of damp wool, leather, and candle smoke clung to the carriage walls. Adrian sat motionless in the shadows, one gloved hand resting near the case, the other near the inside of his coat. His silence no longer seemed like indifference. It had weight, purpose, as if every breath he chose not to spend on words was being saved for something more necessary. Outside, The city gave way to open countryside, then to miles of black fields shining under the rain. No escort followed them after the second bridge. No royal guards. No bright procession. Only one dark carriage, 2 horses, and a driver whose hat was pulled so low Clara could not see his face whenever lightning showed him through the front glass. She noticed, after a time, that they had not taken the main northern road. The lamps of village inns should have appeared by now, warm and ordinary through the weather, but the world beyond the window was empty except for hedges, wet stone walls, and the thin shapes of winter trees. Clara looked toward Adrian. He had noticed too. His eyes were not on her. They were fixed on the passing road, on the way the carriage leaned into each turn, on the faint glow of a lantern that appeared and vanished far behind them. A rider, perhaps, or only a trick of rain. Clara pressed her fingers tighter together. "Is Ravenshade far?" she asked softly. Adrian's gaze shifted to her for the first time since they had left the chapel. He did not answer at once. Then he lifted 2 fingers and tapped the side of the carriage. Almost immediately, the driver changed direction. The turn was sharp enough to make Clara catch the seat. The wooden case slid an inch across the floor and struck Adrian's boot. His expression did not change, but his hand closed over the handle before it could move again. Clara's heart beat hard. "My lord," she said, the words barely steady. "Are we being followed?" The question hung between them like a candle flame in a closed room. Adrian looked toward the rear window. The distant lantern appeared again, then disappeared behind the rain. He leaned forward, took the curtain cord, and drew the black velvet across the glass. The carriage became darker at once. He still did not speak. That frightened her more than any answer could have. The road worsened as they climbed into the northern hills, the wheels sinking through mud, the horses breathing hard in the cold. At last, after what felt like hours, the carriage passed between 2 iron gates twisted with thorn vines. Ravenshade Hall rose ahead through the storm, a great stone house set against a stand of black pines, its towers narrow, its windows tall, most of them unlit. It did not look welcoming. It looked watchful. But as Clara stepped down, Adrian offered his hand without looking at her, and though his glove was cold, his grip was steady enough to keep her from slipping on the rain-slick steps. The front doors opened before they reached them. An elderly butler stood beneath the arch, holding a brass lamp. His face, lined and grave, softened with surprise when he saw Clara. "My lord," he said, then bowed to her. "My lady, my lady." The words entered her quietly, strangely. Not prisoner, not burden, not sacrifice. Inside, Ravenshade smelled of old wood, stone, and fires lit too late in rooms too large to warm. Portraits lined the entrance hall, many covered in gray cloth. A staircase rose into darkness. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock struck 7, each chime slow enough to make the silence after it feel deliberate. Adrian handed the sealed wine case to the butler, but did not release it until the old man met his eyes. Something passed between them without speech. The butler's face paled. "In the bridal chamber?" he asked under his breath. Adrian gave one brief nod. Clara heard it. She was meant to. The chamber prepared for her stood at the end of the west corridor, where rain tapped against diamond-paned windows and the walls held the cold like memory. A small supper had been laid beside the hearth, bread, broth, sugared pears, and 2 crystal cups waiting beside the royal wine. Clara looked at them, then at Adrian. He stood in the doorway, his face half lit by the fire, watching the table as if it were not a table at all, but a battlefield arranged in silver and glass. For the first time since leaving the chapel, Clara understood that the danger had traveled with them. The bridal chamber seemed to breathe around Clara, taking in the rain, the firelight, the silence, and giving back only cold. She stood near the hearth with her damp veil removed and folded over the back of a chair, her mother's gown still clinging at the hem from the storm. Across the room, Adrian Blackwell remained by the supper table, one hand resting lightly on the sealed wine case. The butler had left them after lighting 3 more candles, though his final glance toward the count had been filled with such quiet dread that Clara had felt it settle beneath her ribs. A bride should have been frightened of being alone with a husband she did not know. Clara was frightened of the cups. They waited side by side on the white linen, clear as ice, innocent as church bells. Beside them stood the bottle from the royal case, its dark glass beaded with moisture, the king's red wax seal cut cleanly at the neck. Adrian had opened it himself. He had done so without ceremony, without haste, and with the concentration of a man unlocking a door behind which something might be listening. "You need not stand," Clara said softly, though she did not know why she offered him comfort when she was the one trembling. He turned his eyes toward her, gray in the candlelight, unreadable and tired. He gave no answer. Instead, he poured wine into one cup, then the other, filling them no higher than a finger's width. The red liquid caught the fire and turned almost black. Clara watched his hands. They were steady, too steady. A terrible thought came to her then, colder than the room. What if he knew because he had agreed to it? What if the ruined count had accepted not a wife, but an instruction, the king's discarded witness, delivered to Ravenshade where every misfortune would be believed? Clara forced herself to move before fear could root her to the floor. "If this is a toast," she said, "then let it be brief." Adrian's gaze sharpened faintly, as if the small edge in her voice had surprised him. Still, he said nothing. Clara lifted the nearer cup. The glass was cold against her glove. She could hear rain striking the windows, hear the fire shift in the grate, hear her own heartbeat beneath the high collar of her gown. Adrian's hand moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. Only enough that the candlelight slid across the black leather of his glove. Then his voice broke the long silence between them. "Do not drink from that cup." Clara froze. The words were low, controlled, and entirely without performance. They struck the room like a bell struck underwater. She lowered the cup an inch. "Why?" Adrian crossed to her in 3 measured steps and took the glass from her hand with a gentleness so exact it felt more alarming than force. He set it on the table, then selected a silver spoon from the supper tray. "Because His Majesty's gifts are rarely gifts," he said. It was the first full sentence he had given her, and somehow it carried 7 years of bitterness without raising its voice. He dipped the spoon into the wine. Clara watched the polished bowl of silver vanish beneath the red surface. When he lifted it again, the metal had dulled to a cloudy gray. A thin stain crept along its edge, ugly and unmistakable. Clara stepped back, one hand finding the carved post of the bed, not for modesty, not for fear of him, but because the floor beneath her seemed suddenly unreliable. Adrian carried the cup to the hearth and poured the wine into the flames. The fire hissed softly, curling inward before rising again. "No violence, no spectacle, only proof. They expected you to be found at dawn," Adrian said, pale, still, and blamed on terror. A fragile bride overcome by the thought of sharing a roof with the monster of Ravenshade. Clara's throat tightened. The word monster did not belong to him when he said it. It belonged to everyone who had placed it on his back and made him carry it. "You knew," she whispered. Adrian looked toward the wine case. "I suspected, and you said nothing all day. If I had spoken in the chapel, Lord Malcolm would have changed the method before we reached the gate." The name made the chamber feel smaller. Clara remembered the eastern corridor, the prince's fading whisper, the black seal, the way Malcolm had smiled as though her memory were a candle he could pinch out whenever he pleased. Adrian saw the recognition cross her face. His expression shifted then, barely, but enough. Not surprise. Confirmation. "You saw something," he said. Clara did not answer. She did not need to. For the first time since the king's decree, the silence between them was not a wall. It was a bridge, narrow and dangerous, stretching across the darkness. Adrian took the second cup, poured it untouched into the fire, then set both glasses upside down on the table. "Listen carefully, Countess," he said, and the title sounded less like ownership than a shield being lifted. "From this moment, every servant in this house will believe you retired safely. Every window in this wing will be watched. No food or drink will reach you unless it passes through my hands or Mrs. Vale's. And no one from the palace will be admitted after dark." Clara looked at him, this husband forced upon her, this ruined man with a voice like winter stone, and felt the first strange ache of hope. "Why protect me?" she asked. Adrian's eyes held hers across the candlelight. "Because they sent you here to die," he said. "And I have buried enough of the king's secrets." The word secrets remained in the room long after Adrian spoke it, resting between the overturned cups, the untouched bread, and the bridal candles that had begun to bend beneath their own melting wax. Clara stood very still, her hand pressed to the carved bedpost, trying to gather the pieces of the night into something her mind could hold. The king had smiled. Lord Malcolm had sent wine. Adrian had saved her. And somewhere behind all of it lay the prince's final whisper in the eastern corridor, a whisper she had spent 3 nights pretending she had not heard. "The Black Seal," she said at last, so softly the rain almost swallowed it. Adrian's eyes changed. Not widened, not softened, only sharpened, as if a locked door inside him had heard its key turn. "What did you say?" Clara drew a slow breath. Prince Edmund said those words before the palace announced his fever. "I was not meant to be in that corridor. I had gone to find my cousin. I heard a voice. His voice. He said, 'Tell her the Black Seal.'" The candles trembled. Adrian turned away from her, but not before she saw the strain pass over his face. He walked to the window and moved the curtain by less than an inch, looking down into the rain-dark courtyard. "Then they were right to fear you," he said. Clara's throat tightened. "I do not even know what it means." "No," he replied, "but I do." Before he could explain, a distant bell sounded somewhere beyond the house, faint beneath the weather. Once, twice, 3 times. Adrian went still. The chamber door opened a few inches, and the elderly butler appeared without stepping across the threshold. His name, Clara remembered, was Mr. Hale. The lamplight in his hand made his face look older than it had in the hall. "My lord," he said quietly, "a rider from the South Road." He carried palace colors and would not give his name. Adrian moved at once. "Where is he?" "Gone. He left this." Mr. Hale held out a folded paper sealed with plain wax. Adrian took it, broke the seal, and read. Clara watched the color drain from what little warmth his face possessed. He handed the note to her without a word. The handwriting was formal, elegant, and unmistakably official. By morning, the court would be informed that Lady Clara Blackwell, overcome by distress following her sudden marriage, had passed peacefully before dawn at Ravenshade Hall. The statement had already been prepared. The hour of death had been left blank. Clara read the lines once, then again, because surely language could not be so calm while arranging her disappearance from the world. "They wrote this before I reached the house," she whispered. Before the wine was poured, Adrian took the note back and held it near the candle, but did not burn it. "They expected my reputation to finish what the cup began. A frightened bride, a cursed house, a husband no one trusts. The story would have required very little effort." Clara looked toward the dark windows. Somewhere beyond them, 30 miles of wet road led back to a palace where her name was already being prepared for mourning. She thought of her aunt waking to that announcement. She thought of the court lowering its eyes in practiced sorrow. She thought of Lord Malcolm folding his hands over his cane, satisfied that memory could be buried as neatly as a body. Her fear did not vanish. It changed shape. It became something colder, straighter. "Then let them believe it," she said. Adrian looked at her. For the first time that night, surprise crossed his face openly. Clara's fingers tightened around her mother's handkerchief, still hidden in her palm from the chapel. "If they think I am gone, they may stop watching for me. If they think Ravenshade swallowed me, then perhaps Ravenshade can hide me." Mr. Hale bowed his head slightly, as though he had just witnessed the moment a frightened bride became a countess in truth. Adrian studied her across the candlelight. "That choice would cost you the world you knew." Clara almost smiled, though there was no happiness in it. "That world handed me a poisoned cup." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Binding silence. Adrian turned to Mr. Hale. "Wake Mrs. Vale. No one beyond the West Wing sees Lady Clara until I say otherwise. At dawn, send word that my wife is unwell and not receiving visitors. If another message comes from the palace, it comes to me unopened." Mr. Hale bowed and vanished into the corridor. When the door closed, Clara felt the vastness of Ravenshade settle around her, not as a prison now, but as a fortress with tired walls and a wounded master. Adrian crossed to the hearth, where the last stain of the wine had disappeared into ash. "There is a room below the old library," he said. "No one outside this house knows it exists. You will sleep there tonight." Clara should have recoiled at the thought of hidden rooms and locked passages. Instead, she looked at him and saw a man offering shelter in the only language he still trusted: precautions, shadows, and locked doors. "And you?" she asked. "I will remain where they expect me to be," he said. Alone in the bridal chamber of the ruined count, waiting for the king's men to come searching for a death they arranged. Clara stepped closer, just enough for the firelight to touch both their faces at once. You said you had buried enough of the king's secrets. Adrian's gaze lowered briefly to the black ring on his right hand, its surface marked with a seal she could not yet read. Yes, he said, and one of them was my own life. Adrian led Clara through a narrow door concealed behind the western tapestry, and the house seemed to change its breathing as they descended. Above them, Ravenshade Hall held its silence like a nobleman holding a secret at court, but below the library stairs, the air smelled of dust, old paper, and stone that had not seen daylight in generations. Clara gathered her skirt in one hand and followed the glow of Adrian's lamp down 23 steps, each one worn at the center by feet that history had forgotten. He did not offer explanations quickly. She was beginning to understand that words cost him something, not because he had none, but because each one had survived too much. At the bottom, he unlocked an iron-banded door with a key taken from a chain beneath his collar. The room beyond was small, but not poor. A narrow bed stood against the wall, already made with clean linen and a folded wool blanket. A writing desk sat beneath a high grate where rain whispered somewhere far above. Shelves lined the stone walls, filled with ledgers, sealed packets, maps, and books whose leather spines had cracked with age. Clara stepped inside and felt, with a strange ache, that this hidden chamber had been waiting for someone who needed to vanish without being lost. Adrian set the lamp on the desk. This was built during the border wars, he said, for heirs, documents, and inconvenient truths. Clara looked at the shelves. Which am I? His eyes met hers. Alive. That is enough for tonight. The answer should have been cold, yet it steadied her. She moved toward the desk and noticed a black ring lying beside a stack of folded letters, identical to the one he wore, except its seal had been pressed flat into wax more than once. The mark was not a crown. It was a raven surrounded by a broken circle. The black seal, she whispered. Adrian stood very still. Then he reached past her, opened the upper drawer, and removed a packet bound with faded blue ribbon. He placed it on the desk between them, as if setting down a memory too heavy to hold. 7 years ago, Prince Edmund came to me with letters proving that funds meant for widows, orphans, and wounded soldiers had been stolen through the king's private council. The orders bore no royal signature, only this seal, Lord Malcolm's unofficial mark. Clara touched the ribbon but did not untie it. Then why were you ruined? A quiet, humorless breath left him. Because I believed truth would be enough. He turned toward the shelves, his face half shadowed by the lamp. I brought the evidence to court. By sunrise, the letters had disappeared. By noon, witnesses withdrew their statements. By evening, I was accused of forging documents to embarrass the crown. Clara felt the cold of the chamber press through her sleeves. And no one defended you. One person tried. His voice lowered. Eleanor Vale. My betrothed. Clara recognized the surname. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, perhaps a sister or mother. She did not ask. Some griefs announced their own boundaries. Adrian continued after a long silence. Eleanor knew where I had hidden copies. She was to bring them here. She never arrived. The court called it a carriage accident on a flooded road. Ravenshade called it the night the house stopped lighting its windows. No violence colored his words. That made them worse. They fell quietly, like snow-covering graves. Clara looked at his gloved hands and understood that the ruined count had not been ruined by scandal alone, but by surviving when every honorable instinct in him had been punished. I am sorry, she said. Adrian looked away as if kindness were more difficult to endure than accusation. Do not pity me. I do not. Her voice was soft, but steady. I am recognizing you. He turned back then, and for one unguarded moment the man behind the rumors stood before her. Not a monster, not a traitor, not a cursed bridegroom, but someone who had stood too long in a storm no one else admitted was falling. Clara untied the blue ribbon. Inside were letters, lists of names, routes marked across the kingdom, and a small sheet bearing a black wax impression. The same phrase returned to her from the eastern corridor, thin and desperate from Prince Edmund's lips. Tell her the black seal. He meant these, she said. Adrian nodded. He meant whoever survived long enough to listen. Clara lowered herself into the chair, no longer because her knees were weak, but because the truth required a different kind of strength. Then I will listen. Adrian studied her, and something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the first faint thaw beneath winter earth. If you do this, Clara, you will not be able to return to the woman you were this morning. She looked at the sealed letters, then at the hidden room, then at the man who had saved her life before asking for her trust. That woman was sent here to die, she said. Let her stay dead a little longer. By dawn, Clara Whitmore had vanished from the living world by order of a lie, and by noon she had begun the patient work of becoming dangerous. Ravenshade Hall moved above her in muted sounds, doors closing softly, servants crossing distant corridors, rainwater tapping through old gutters, Mr. Hale's measured voice sending away the first palace messenger with news that the Countess was too unwell to receive anyone. Below the library, in the hidden room of stone and paper, Clara sat wrapped in a dark wool shawl, while Adrian spread 7 years of buried truth across the desk. There were ledgers with careful columns, letters written in trembling hands, receipts from royal offices, and names of families who had never known why their petitions for aid had been denied. The black seal appeared again and again, pressed into wax beside instructions that never named the king, yet moved with the king's shadow. Clara read until the words blurred. She read until grief became order. She read until Prince Edmund's final whisper no longer sounded like a mystery, but a duty. Adrian stood across from her, speaking only when necessary, guiding her through dates, signatures, and the false accusations that had destroyed him. Once, near mid-afternoon, she noticed him grip the edge of the desk as his injured hand stiffened in the cold. He hit it almost immediately. Clara said nothing. She rose, took the kettle from the small hearth, poured warm water into a basin, and placed a clean cloth beside him. "You should rest your hand," she said. His expression closed by habit. "It is nothing." That is what people say when they have had no one allowed to care. The room became very quiet. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the silence between them changed again. Not softer, deeper. He allowed her to wrap the cloth around his hand, and the gesture was so small that the world above would have laughed at it. Yet for Clara it felt larger than any vow spoken in the royal chapel. No one had forced this. No king had commanded it. It was only one wounded person choosing not to let another suffer unnoticed. That evening, Mrs. Vale brought soup, bread, and a plain black dress from storage, laying them on the bed with a curtsy that held no curiosity and no fear. She was a stern woman with silver threaded through her dark hair and eyes that had once known too much sorrow to waste words on gossip. "His lordship says you will need something less visible than white satin," she said. Clara touched the dress. "Did you know Eleanor?" Mrs. Vale's hand stilled. "She was my daughter." Clara's breath caught, but Mrs. Vale only smoothed the sleeve. She believed the truth was worth the cost. "I have spent 7 years wishing she had been less brave. Today, I find myself ashamed of that wish." Clara took her hand gently. "I will not waste what she tried to protect." Mrs. Vale's face trembled for half a second before dignity restored it. "Then you are more than the bride they sent here." When night fell, Adrian returned with a map of Ashbourne Palace. He had marked the eastern corridor, the council chamber, the private archive, and the route by which Prince Edmund must have reached the room where Clara had seen him. "There will be a royal gathering in 3 nights," he said. "The king intends to strip Ravenshade of its last title and lands. He believes your death has made me defenseless." Clara looked at the map, then at the letters, then at the black dress waiting on the bed. "Then we let him believe it until the doors open." Adrian's gaze held hers. "You understand what that means. It means I appear before the court as a ghost they failed to bury." He studied her in the lamplight, and something close to pride touched his eyes before he could hide it. "You were afraid last night." "I am afraid now," Clara said. "But fear is not the same as surrender." Later, when the hour was deep and Ravenshade seemed to sleep, they sat together in the old library above the hidden room, sorting the final letters by candlelight. Rain had stopped at last. Moonlight rested on the covered portraits. Adrian placed his coat around Clara's shoulders without a word when the fire burned low. She did not thank him aloud. She only drew it closer, and he did not ask for it back. Neither of them spoke of love. Such a word would have been too fragile, too bright, too easily frightened away. But when their hands met over the same letter and neither moved for a breath too long, Clara understood that something had begun in the ruins. Not comfort, not safety, Something stronger. A vow made without witnesses, written in silence, and sealed not with a crown, but with trust. 3 nights later, Ashbourne Palace glowed as if it had never known darkness. Every window of the grand ballroom burned with candlelight. Every mirror multiplied the gold. Every noble voice rose and fell in polished amusement beneath the painted ceiling where angels looked down with blind, perfect eyes. King Roland stood near the dais in ceremonial crimson, receiving bows with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed all inconvenient things had been removed from his path. Lord Malcolm Vane stood at his right, one hand folded over the silver hawk of his cane, his smile thin, his black seal hidden somewhere beneath the lace of his cuff. At the center of the room, Adrian Blackwell waited alone. He wore the same black coat he had worn at the wedding, brushed clean but severe enough to make the jeweled crowd seem almost childish around him. No one stood near him. They left a respectful distance, or a fearful one. It made little difference. To them he was still the ruined count, summoned before the throne to lose the final scraps of a name the court had already buried. The king lifted a hand, and the music faded. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice warm enough to deceive anyone who had never been cold. "Tonight we must address a sorrowful matter. The House of Ravenshade has long carried burdens of scandal, misfortune, and disloyalty. Recent events have deepened our concern." A graceful murmur passed through the ballroom. Adrian did not move. King Roland's gaze rested on him with public mercy and private triumph. In light of the tragic passing of Lady Clara Blackwell, so soon after her unhappy marriage, the Crown has determined that the Ravenshade title and lands must return to royal stewardship. Lord Malcolm lowered his eyes as if in mourning. "A necessary mercy," he murmured, just loud enough to be heard. Adrian looked toward the closed ballroom doors. Once, only once, but it was enough. The doors opened. The sound was not loud, yet it cut through the room more cleanly than thunder. Clara stepped into the light wearing the plain black dress Mrs. Vale had given her, altered with a narrow line of silver at the cuffs. No veil covered her face. No jewels softened her pallor. She looked exactly like what the court had declared her to be, a woman returned from the edge of their lie. Conversation died so completely that the candles seemed to hiss. A glass slipped from someone's hand and struck the carpet without breaking. King Roland's smile remained for one impossible second before it faded. Lord Malcolm's fingers tightened on his cane. Clara walked forward with Adrian at her side now, not behind her, not before her, but beside her. Every step across the polished floor felt longer than the aisle of the chapel, yet this time she was not walking toward a sentence. She was carrying one. "Your Majesty," Clara said, her voice clear enough to reach the farthest corner of the ballroom. "I apologize for the inconvenience of being alive." A sharp breath moved through the crowd. Adrian placed a leather folio on the table before the dais. Clara laid Prince Edmund's final letter beside it, along with the black wax impression, the ledgers, and the royal notice prepared before her supposed death. "3 nights ago," she continued, "a notice of my passing was written before I had even entered Ravenshade Hall. Wine sent under royal seal was placed in my chamber. Had my husband not spoken when he did, the court would be mourning a story arranged in advance." The word husband trembled faintly, not with fear, but with meaning. Adrian heard it. His face remained composed, yet something in his eyes shifted toward light. Lord Malcolm stepped forward. "This is absurd theater from a frightened young woman manipulated by a disgraced man." Clara turned to him. "Prince Edmund said to tell her the black seal." The color left Malcolm's face. It was a small thing, a draining of pride, but the court saw it. Adrian opened the folio and spoke at last, his voice carrying the calm force of a bell in winter. 7 years of records. 7 years of missing funds. 7 years of orders marked not by the crown, but by Lord Malcolm's private seal, carried out under royal protection. King Roland gripped the arm of his chair. Around him, nobles who had once enjoyed silence began to understand its cost. The royal council demanded the documents. Witnesses came forward before dawn. By morning, Lord Malcolm was stripped of office and held for judgment by the High Court. King Roland, no longer able to hide behind ceremony, surrendered his authority to the council pending inquiry. It did not happen like a battle in a song. It happened in whispers, signatures, pale faces, and doors closing on men who had believed power meant never answering. When the sun finally rose over the palace, Clara stood on the terrace with Adrian, looking down at gardens washed clean by rain. The world had not healed. Not yet, but it had turned. Adrian removed a folded paper from his coat and offered it to her. An annulment petition, he said quietly, and signed, "If you wish to be free of Ravenshade, no one will stop you." Clara looked at the paper, then at the man who had saved her life before asking for her heart. "I was forced to marry you," she said, "but no one forced me to trust you." He lowered his gaze, as if hope were a language he had forgotten how to read. Clara took the petition, folded it once, and placed it into the terrace fire. The paper curled into ash between them. Adrian's breath caught softly. She slipped her hand into his, not as a frightened bride, not as a royal witness, but as a woman choosing where her future would begin. Some hearts do not learn to beat again in the warmth of easy days. Some wait in ruined houses, behind locked doors and winter rain, until the right hand reaches through the darkness and calls them living.